Hi, and welcome back to our APES Flipped Classroom. And today we're continuing our discussion of agriculture as part of land use. And today we're talking about meat production methods. And we're going to talk about industrial as well as kind of more traditional or sustainable meat production methods. So first thing that we're going to talk about is what are called CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations. This is what we typically think of when we think of meat production. These are feedlots. And so in a feedlot, the animals are crowded very densely. They are generally fed grain. Most of the time that would be corn. The goal is to raise animals to maturity or to slaughtering age as quickly as possible. So here's an example. You see a picture of a cattle feedlot. Also, poultry houses are considered CAFOs, or controlled animal feeding operations. So we use these because they maximize land use, which of course then maximizes profit because you make the most meat production per unit area possible. This, of course, minimizes the cost of meat for consumers. On the downside, this tends to increase antibiotic use as well as growth hormone use. The antibiotics are used both to prevent disease and to speed meat production. So animals, particularly beef and pork, cattle and pigs, tend to be on low levels of antibiotics. Chickens legally cannot be fed antibiotics, so that's not an issue in poultry production, but it is an issue with beef and pork. In addition, very often they're fed growth hormones to speed that meat production, to make the animals grow a bit larger, faster. With all these animals in one space, there's a large amount of waste, and that waste is collected in one place rather than being spread out as it would be if the animals were grazing. So that large volume of waste, if it's not well contained, can contaminate nearby surface waters, or even if it seeps in through the ground, can contaminate groundwater. This also produces large amounts of carbon dioxide because of the equipment that's used, large amounts of methane because of the digestive process of cattle and pork. And it also, in the decomposition of the manure, produces dinitrogen monoxide. All three of those are greenhouse gases. So they produce large amounts of greenhouse gases, which contribute to climate change. So one of the kind of important aspects of these CAFOs are these manure lagoons. And so these are large open storage pits for the animal waste. And the image you're seeing here is actually an image of a hog farm. Hog waste harbors a particular bacterium that actually makes the manure lagoons appear pink. So these are large open storage pits. So you may see them. This one is clearly not from a hog farm because it's not pink. That waste contains ammonia or nitrogen in some form. It if the animals are fed hormones, it can contain the hormones. It can contain antibiotics, and of course, it also contains fecal coliform bacteria. E. coli is kind of our indicator for fecal coliform bacteria. E. coli itself is not usually a harmful bacterium, but it is an indicator of the presence of other fecal coliform bacteria. Occasionally, heavy rains can flood these lagoons. They can contaminate nearby surface water and groundwater with runoff when they do flood. So here's an image of flooding after, I believe this is after Michael in North Carolina. And when there's this much water, there's simply no way to contain those manure lagoons. And so the manure is going to wind up in nearby bodies of water. We can have toxic bacteria that enter the waterways. If that ammonia, well, obviously the ammonia is going to enter the waterways, which can lead to eutrophication. And then those antibiotics can lead to bacterial resistance to antibiotics. And the hormones are endocrine disruptors, so they can alter the hormonal system of amphibians, particularly are vulnerable to this, that live in those bodies of water. But if it enters the human drinking water supply, it can also have an effect on human endocrine systems. And then, as I said a few minutes ago, the denitrification of ammonia in these manure lagoons can produce dinitrogen monoxide, which is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. It's actually a more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. If they're well managed, manure lagoons can be emptied, they can be buried in landfills, they can be turned into fertilizer pellets. So this is a way to be more sustainable about what's in the manure lagoons. Manure lagoons do tend to be aerated, so that's allowing beneficial bacteria to process the nitrates or ammonia that's in the manure so that it is no longer going to cause eutrophication if it enters the water system. Okay, so an alternative to CAFOs is what we call free range grazing. And this is usually mostly cattle that are used free range grazing, but we can talk about free range poultry as well. And this is where the animals graze on grass and they grow at a natural rate. They're not using growth hormones. They have more space to graze. We're not specifically raising grain for the cattle to grow. So because the population is more spread out, there's no need for antibiotics. It doesn't require the production of grain, alfalfa, or corn to feed the animals. And the waste is dispersed over the land naturally, which means that it acts as a fertilizer for those grazing areas instead of building up in lagoons. Unfortunately, on the downside, this does mean that there's more land use per pound of meat, which means that it's more expensive for the consumer. Another plus side of free range grazing is that animals can graze on land that's too dry for most crop growth because the grass doesn't require as much water as most crops. Another benefit of free range grazing is that free range grazing can share space with things like windmills and solar farms. And so the land can be used for a dual purpose. Unfortunately, if grazing isn't rotated, then we can wind up with the problem of overgrazing, which is where too many animals graze on an area of land, and that can wind up destroying, removing all of the vegetation, which can lead to topsoil erosion. So you can see in this image that on one side of the fence, the area has been overgrazed. That's why you see very little green and you see lots of exposed soil. And on the right side of the fence, it has not been overgrazed. If the animals are kept in a smaller area for grazing, they can also, by repeated stepping on the ground, trotting on the ground, can compact the soil. And we know that when soil is compacted, that decreases its water holding capacity, which also can cause more erosion and also decreases its ability to hold on to nutrients. If plants are killed by overgrazing and the soil is compacted so much that it can't hold the water anymore, we can actually wind up with desertification, which is where arable land becomes like a desert and is not able to grow crops anymore. This can be prevented by rotational grazing. So if the animals are moved periodically, then they can actually be, as we talked about in a sustainable agriculture, they can actually be good for the grass. They can increase its growth because they are distributing that natural fertilizer, that manure. They are clipping the grass back to a size where it grows really rapidly, and it has nice, strong root systems that help to prevent the erosion, allow the grass to access water that is deeper in the soil as well. So overgrazing problems can be prevented by rotational grazing. Just requires more land, and it requires manpower to move the animals from one location to another. So there's the image again about increasing growth rate by keeping it clipped back below the level where seed pods form. So even when meat is sustainably harvested, when we have rotational grazing, when we are steering clear of those CAFOs, meat is still a very inefficient way to feed humans. It's far less efficient than producing plants in terms of energy use, land use, and water use. So when we talk about energy use, we're talking about the energy needed to plant and grow and harvest plants to feed the animals. Plus, we're talking about the energy that's needed to bring water to the animals, plus the energy that's needed in the housing of the animals, plus the energy that's used in slaughtering and packaging the animals. So there's a lot of energy that's required to produce 1 pound of any meat. And as you see from our graphic here, it's substantially more than fruits and vegetables. Beef is by far the highest energy requiring meat. So eating lower essentially on the energy source is more sustainable. And of course, land. When we produce meat for humans, we use lots more land than if we were to simply grow plants. And so when we talk about land, we're talking about the land, that is used to grow plants to feed the animals, plus the room that the animals themselves take up. So if we're doing rotational grazing or free range grazing, then there's the land that they occupy and the land to raise their food is the same. So per acre of farmland, you can see much lower usable protein for beef or for other meat. Soy is a protein replacement that packs a major punch in terms of usable protein per acre. And when we talk about water, we're talking about the water for growing the crops that the animals eat, as well as the water that the animals drink. So again, we see a graphic here with how much water it takes to produce just 1 gram of protein. And again, substantially more for all of our animal-based protein sources. So your practice FRQ for today is to explain one environmental benefit of eating a plant-based diet rather than a meat-based diet. I've given you the graphic for water. You could go back and look at any of the other graphics as well. All right, that's it for our conversation about meat production. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Look forward to seeing you in class.